Hello and welcome to another episode of The Startup Show, brought to you by Inc. Authority. I'm your host, Trevor Rowley. Today we're going to talk about a very important subject. We're going to talk about what business owners need to look at and review on the anniversary of their business. And to help walk us through the process, we've got a terrific, very special guest. Please welcome to the program, Clara Ramirez. Hi, Clara. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm good. How are you, Trevor?
Good, good. So, Clara, you're a renewal specialist at Inc. Authority. And as a result, you get to talk to people on the anniversary of their business. And what other things do you kind of talk to them about at that time?
So first of all, I congratulate them because it's a big deal. And I go over their statutory requirements as well as keeping their documentation in order.
Awesome. I love that you say, hey, it's a congratulatory call, because it really is, right? Small business is the fuel that runs the nation's economy, and we love small business owners around the country. And it is a big deal, whether you get through business 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, it's pretty amazing. So as I understand it, there's kind of a checklist, right, that a business owner should go through at each anniversary, just to make sure that everything's in order, that all of the protections that they've invested in with their corporation or their LLC, that they remain intact. And a couple of those things I think we've talked about on another episode. We've talked about the need to go to the state where they originally filed their corporation, their LLC. There's usually an annual report that's due of some kind. Usually talking to your registered agent to make sure everything is in order, to make sure that that service continues. But what we want to focus on today is some of the documentation, the paperwork that needs to take place every year. It's not people's favorite subject because nobody really likes to have meetings and record paperwork, but it's absolutely necessary when it comes to maintaining the integrity of somebody's business, their corporation or their LLC. So when we're talking about documentation or paperwork, what is it that we're really talking about, Clara?
Okay, so it's very important to keep the documentation for an LLC or a corporation in order. So for a corporation, it's a little bit more strict. You have a couple more rules that you need to abide by. You have to have a shareholders meeting and you have to have a board of directors meeting. And these need to be documented in your record book. If you have an LLC, it's a best practice to conduct your annual minute meeting.
Yeah, that's really good information because the way that corporations are treated and the way that LLCs are treated, they're a little bit different. There are some similarities, but there are some significant differences. And one of them, as you just pointed out, is it really is for a corporation, it's mandatory to hold the shareholder meeting, and the shareholders are the owners. So the owners all get together, they have this meeting. And one of the things on their agenda, of course, is to appoint the board of directors. There could be other things on their agenda, but there's at least that. And then in turn, also on a mandatory basis, the board of directors get together and they have their meeting. And often on their agenda, it's let's appoint the officers, the president, the secretary, the treasurer, etc. They probably have some other things on the agenda, but at a minimum, they do that, even if there's very little activity. And when we say mandatory, what's the consequence for a corporation if they don't do these things?
So it's very important because, as you know, corporate veil is one of the main reasons why you would incorporate a company. For that legal separation, you need to make sure that you're abiding by the rules of a corporation and practicing the minute meetings and your shareholder meetings, board of director meetings.
Yeah. Because if you don't hold these meetings, I think, as I understand it, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but if you don't hold the meetings and then record, the decisions that are being made, sometimes we talk about them as the minutes of the meeting, but basically that's recording what took place and what the decisions were and so forth. But in a corporation, if you don't do these things, then a court of law, for example, might say, hey, you're not acting like a corporation. We shouldn't afford you the protection, the limited liability protection. And in some cases, somebody can lose their rights to limited liability because they're not acting the way that they should as a corporation. Really, really, really important. Now, you were saying that LLCs are a little bit more lenient, and how is that?
So you don't have the two meetings that you need to conduct because you don't have shareholders and board of director meetings. But you still need to make sure that you're holding those practices. And if you ever, let's say, are trying to get investors or partnerships, this is something that's going to be very important. It's not something that you're required to have. However, it is going to be very important if you're practicing like an LLC.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that really draws people to LLCs as the type of structure for their business is the ease of use and the flexibility and the non-mandatory requirement to hold these meetings and record everything. But as you mentioned, it's going to be really hard to conduct business if you don't do these things, if you don't do the paperwork, right? I can think of an example for instance, where somebody wants to go open a bank account for their LLC. Well, you can walk into the bank and say, hey, I want to open an account. And they're going to say, well, who are you in relation to this LLC? And they want something that's evidence of the fact that you've been authorized on behalf of that LLC to open the account and to name signers on the account. And the only way you're going to be able to produce that is through a banking resolution, for example, a document that has to be prepared on behalf of the LLC. So while it may not be mandatory to do some of these same things in the same sense that it is for a corporation, the reality is that if you don't do these, you're going to have a hard time conducting business, even as something as simple as setting up a bank account. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. You do need to, not just bank account, it could impact a lot of other things you might want to do with the company if you're trying to expand, if you're trying to open up in a different state, or if you're trying to just make changes for the company. You do need to make sure that everything is correctly documented in your records.
Yeah. I think when we think of meetings and paperwork and documentation, these annual meetings that you've spoken of are the first things that come to our mind. But in reality, there is the potential to have a need for a lot of other documents, right? For instance, if I am a corporation and I'm the secretary of that corporation, but for some reason during the course of the year, the corporation wants to remove me as the secretary, they're going to have a meeting to vote to remove me as the secretary. That's one set of documentation. They're probably going to have another resolution to appoint somebody new to be that secretary in my stead. And then there's going to be an acceptance of that appointment, another document where the person signs that they're going to accept that appointment. There's the potential to have 3 pieces of paper just to make that change of replacing me as the secretary and adding somebody else. So when you start to think about the kinds of things that can happen over the course of the year, whether it's leadership changing or whether it's declarations of distributions or making a major purchase, for example, that you need to show that the company authorized the purchase, there's potential for a lot of documents. Would that be right? Am I missing anything? Are there other kinds of documents you can think of?
Yeah, that's correct, Trevor. So documenting, you have to make sure you document when you open up a bank account, with what bank you opened it, and you want to make sure that you document any new partners. When you appoint yourself as a manager, that needs to be documented as well. So just about any major decision for the company needs to be documented in your records.
Yeah, it's just a really good business practice, first and foremost, right? I've talked to LLC owners, for example, who started as maybe a one-person LLC, and they thought, well, why should I really be, conducting meetings with myself? We'll address that specifically in just a minute. But it turns out that later on, they've got somebody who's interested in their business. They're having some success. Somebody else wants to come in as an investor. And how are they going to do their due diligence and see if that person really is the person who's the owner of the company, if they really are doing the things that they say that they're doing? And having access to the record book of that company has been the difference between gaining an investor or not gaining an investor. So it really is important. But let's go back to this one-person LLC or one-person corporation idea. Typically we think about holding meetings. We're talking about, getting a bunch of people together and having a meeting. And that may be the case if there's a bunch of people involved in the corporation or the LLC. But what if it's just me, Clara? How do I hold a meeting when it's just me?
Yeah. Okay. It does sound a little bit silly saying that you have to hold a meeting, even though it could just be you for a company. But it is the best practice. You want to make sure that you're separating yourself legally as much as possible from the company. And so when you provide documentation saying, I've done this, I've made this decision for the company, all of the changes that you may have made, you want to make sure they're properly documented in your records so you can prove that you are 2 separate entities.
Wow, Clara, that's a brilliant observation that you've made there. The importance of maintaining a separation between the individual and the business entity, right? And one of the ways you do that is by holding the meetings, even if it's just you as a person, right? Hey, you can get 100% attendance really easy at your meetings, right?
Exactly.
But you want to hold these meetings, and even if it's a meeting by yourself, and understand kind of what hat you're wearing at that time, right? And then act accordingly. I think that where somebody could get into trouble if they didn't do this sort of thing is, there's such a thing in the law that's called the alter ego doctrine, where somebody says, hey, the business really isn't separate from you, it's just you. And if you're actually holding the meetings that are required of this business and then recording them, it goes a long ways to proving that, hey, this is no alter ego. This is a separate business, and we're handling everything as we should as a business. Now, here's the big question. I've been dying to ask this of you since we started this, because I'm not a big fan of anything paperwork related. Don't love it. I don't want to have to be one that has to figure out the way to write up all of these important legal documents. So I'm sure you run into people like me all the time. What can you do to help somebody like me that the thought and idea of preparing documents scares me to death?
I completely understand. Most people, usually they're going to be really good at what they do. And documentation is going to be something that you don't really think about on a daily basis. Am I documenting everything correctly? I run into this a lot with trucking companies. You don't have the time. You don't have the resources to be able to sit down and just document meetings and draft everything correctly. And so at Inc. Authority, we do offer a service, Compliance Club. It basically has our legal compliance team, and they help you draft your minute meetings and your resolutions. We make it really, really easy for you. So all you do is we ask you questions, and then we draft the documents for you, so that way you don't have to stress about if you're doing them correctly, if you're if you're missing something, you don't have to stress about that.
Yeah. It's really an incredible service that Inc. Authority offers, because just as you said, not everybody is comfortable sitting and drawing up the documentation required, right? If I'm a baker, I want to be an expert at baking, and I want to be in my bakery, and I want to be selling my goods. I don't want to be worrying about documentation, right? But I know I need to do it, whether it's a best practice or whether it's mandatory if I have a corporation. So having somebody that I can turn to, that I can talk to, where there's a document specialist, a compliance specialist, as you call them, who reaches out to me and says, hey, what kind of things have you been doing with your business? What kind of decisions have you made? Who was present? When did you do it? When did you make the decision? And they're going to take that information from you, and they're going to draw up the document on your behalf and send it to you. And all you have to do is sign it and date it, put it in your record book, and it's done. Easy as that, right? And so you called it what? Compliance Club?
Yes.
So Compliance Club is this service, and it's an annual service. And so at any time, any of this documentation that you may need to do through the course of the year, from your annual meetings to special resolutions, etc., you simply talk to this specialist, and they draw up the documentation per your specifications. They send it to you, sign it, date it, goes in your record book, and you can sleep peacefully at night knowing that everything's taken care of. Pretty incredible. I'm sure you've talked to people who've taken advantage of this service in the past. What do they have to say about it?
I was just talking to somebody last week, actually, that they used it a couple years ago with us, and I renewed them last year, and then this year again when we were speaking, they actually incorporated another business. So now they're even more busy, and they could not be more thankful to be able to have someone that is constantly checking in on them and constantly making sure that their paperwork is up to date and making sure that they're not missing anything in their documentation.
Yeah, it's a great feeling to know that everything's taken care of, right? And that you're not worrying about, oh my gosh, I failed to do this or I failed to do that. Just know that it's taken care of, that there's a professional, that's what they do, that's taking care of it for you. And you really provide that at Inc. Authority, which is pretty amazing. Well, thank you, Clara. Appreciate you coming and joining us on the show today. Appreciate the information you've shared with us today about the importance of some things that need to be checked off the list at the anniversary of a business every year. One of those things, registering with the state, paying your fee with the state, filing your annual report, maintaining your registered agent, and the thing that we focused on today, which is making sure that all of your decisions throughout the course of the year, any of the meetings that you've held, that they've all been recorded properly, executed properly, and placed in your record book. Why? So that you can maintain that important asset protection, limited liability protection, and just maintain excellent business practices so that everything's in shape for you going forward.
Yeah.
So really appreciate you joining us today and sharing that information. And thank all of you for joining us again here today on this episode of the Startup Show. Hey, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell while you're there so that you don't miss any of our future content. We'd really appreciate it if you're there. Also hit the like button. Let us know if you like our content. We look forward to bringing it to you again each and every week. Until we see you next time, good luck with your business. Go out there and crush it, and thank you for joining us.